Today, I want to share a little bit about my dad's life and the beauty of it and all that I saw how God worked so powerfully in my dad and through my dad. I want to emphasize his last 8 years when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and the beauty of what God did in that. God allows it, but he would only allow something if he can do something greater in it. And those greater things are eternal things. I saw my dad being prepared to be with Jesus for eternity. And that's what Jesus is trying to do in all of our lives, is to prepare us for eternity. My dad was born in 1923. He would have been 100 this year. He passed when he was 88. He was born in a small town. He had an older sister and a younger brother, and who he loved very, very much. He grew up like most of the people around that time in here, poor, but everybody was poor, or almost everybody was poor. We probably were too when we were growing up, but everybody seemed to be in the same circumstances as we did, and it just seemed like we lived in abundance. And my dad, he always remembered as I drove him around those last 8 years and I would take him through town, he loved to go for drives. And at the end of every drive, he'd say, "This was the best drive I've ever been on. Thank you so much for taking me." Well, he would remember that his grandma would meet him when he would get out of school. And in her apron, she always had cookies to give him. I'm sure she baked him cookies. And that was one of his fondest memories. But every time we passed where his grandma lived, it was now torn down. He'd always remember that. I always thought that was so interesting that the same place was such a beautiful memory of his grandma. And there was not too far from there, he would remember his grandpa and riding horses with him. So I'm not sure if they had some property, some land, and my dad would go with them, take care of the animals. But he remembered those things. And there was beautiful memories to my dad, and he always loved horses. When I think of my dad, I always think of horses with him. He loved them. He loved the whole thing with cowboys and the Western movies, and a great joy to him. So my dad grew up and was so smart. He was a great student and really excelled in school. I remember him saying he wanted to be a doctor, but things didn't turn out that way for him. But he still had a very successful, beautiful life. So he grew up, went to school, and then war. There was war, and my dad was sent to Korea. I believe he volunteered into the military, even uh, going in younger than he was supposed to. He went to war and made great friendships, but he would never talk about it. He would never talk about the war. And when he did, when he watched movies about war, or even movies that kind of resembled the jungles there in Korea, my dad would have nightmares. And like I said, not until later, when he did have Alzheimer's, did he talk about it a little. I remember a man coming to visit, and my dad knew him from the war, and they talked, really alone for a long period. But my dad wouldn't talk about it. I'm sure it was a very difficult season in his life, even when you make great friends. But the things that you do or the things that you're called to do could be great struggles for you. As my dad came back from the war, he worked at the drugstore, he worked as a fireman, and that's where he met my mom at the fireman's ball. And my mom says, "I met Dad at a fireman's ball and thought, yeah, I found myself a dancer." She loved to dance. Little did she know my dad didn't. Wasn't much of a dancer, actually. And my dad was head over heels in love with my mama. And he took her to the movies, asked her to go on a date, and he borrowed a car. He didn't have a vehicle, and they drove to the movies. And then when they got out, my dad was just so focused on my mom, he forgot that he had borrowed a car and he walked her home. I just love that story because it really shows the love my dad had for my mama. And he wanted to marry her, and they got engaged. But my grandma and my aunt and my mom were already going to go to California. Well, the two sisters and some friends, they had already committed to go and they had some jobs lined up. My grandma called my mom on it that she still needed to go. I think my grandma wanted to see if this relationship would last that. And so my mom did go, and for a year, and my dad would write to her all the time. And they are beautiful letters. My mom kept them and shared them, and really showed this beautiful side of my dad. Married in 54, and they moved away. My dad got his teaching degree, and he went to small communities here in New Mexico to teach. And they met people wherever they went, and they had dear friends. And we used to call them auntie and uncle. I thought they were our blood relatives, just deep, dear friends from my parents that lasted a lifetime. My mom and dad tried to start a family, and my mom miscarried several times, and so it was a difficult season with all its blessings, the beginning of a marriage, this beautiful love story. So then they moved back to Las Vegas. After a while, my mom has a daughter, and then another daughter, and then another daughter, and then me, the fourth daughter, number 4. When my dad had Alzheimer's, and he couldn't remember my name once, and he said 4, number 4. I'm the fourth daughter. So my dad, they settled down. My dad he built on the house that was here. It was my grandparents' house. It used to be a little Presbyterian church, and my mom and dad made adobes together, and they built a home for themselves. It's this home right here. They raised their children here, and I believe it was a good life. So within all of those things, we still have struggles that we are working through. I think that all of us, there's wounds in our hearts from different things, either actual things or perceived things. Going to war, being raised in our families, we have wounds. And so my dad, he did as well. And as we were growing up, I saw things that he struggled with anger. He struggled with some unforgiveness. And those were things that were hard for him. I think they're hard for all of us. My dad could really, sometimes those things were difficult for all of us, as I'm sure any of our things are difficult for those around us. But in that, even in all those wounds, my dad was just this charismatic person, extrovert, and in a room with just, everybody loved my daddy. Everybody had a story as he was their teacher or their principal. And it was back in the days when the students could be paddled. And if you got paddled by Mr. Villegas, that was like a story you wanted to pass on. But people really respected him and loved him, parents and students. And my dad loved them too. But as I say, he was extrovert. I saw him a lot of times just as an introvert. He liked to just be home, be quiet, be reading or watching a Western, working in his little shop, cleaning, reorganizing, building something. I think that one thing that was difficult for my mom was that my dad didn't always attend Mass on a consistent basis. And I think that was within his family. My mom, on the other hand, was raised going to daily Mass, saying the rosary every day. But when I was in high school, something happened, and my dad just started going to Mass all the time, and they would go at 8 o'clock in the morning on Sundays. And my mom didn't like getting up that early to be ready to go to Mass at that time, but she was so happy that my dad was going, that became the time that they would go to Mass, and then they would take communion to those that were homebound, and that became their ministry. But really entering into service, my dad, along with my mom, was very beautiful. So my daddy and my mom both retired and living their lives together. This was a time when they started welcoming grandchildren, 5 of them, and they were so happy. It was more, I think, when they're your grandkids, I don't know if it's just not a deeper love, but just a different, more pure, maybe not that huge responsibility on you. But my dad and mom loved being grandma and grandpa. And my dad would spending time with the grandkids, and he would take them for ice cream, and And I'm not sure if they went fishing, but my dad loved to go fishing. My dad was a great uncle, great brother, great grandpa, and that was one part of his life that he loved to share was fishing, and his love for ice cream, his love for sweets. But those grandbabies were, oh my gosh, so special to him. And as time went on, my dad did start to show signs of dementia. It was really difficult. I remember we had to get the keys for my dad from his truck. We were worried from him driving, and also his eyesight wasn't good. And those things start to happen, right? They don't remember. My dad was so good about providing. He was an amazing provider. And my dad would always we had a wood stove. He was always getting wood and chopping kindling and bringing that in and making sure the house was warm. Sometimes we'd be in our bedrooms with the windows open because it was so warm. I remember I lived in Phoenix, and I came home and I'd be, come on, Dad, stoke that fire, because you get used to the Phoenix hot weather, and it was so cold when I came home. And my dad was like, yes. And he was probably so happy that one of us finally wanted him to really warm the house, and could just be so loving. Gave big bear hugs, and it was a joker. Oh, he was a joker. I remember when the hospice nurse came, and he was asking my dad lots of questions, and he'd always answer my dad, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And my dad said to him, don't call me sir. Just like that. Don't call me sir. And the guy kind of, was taken aback and said, well, what would you like me to call you? And my dad was in his little walker, exactly where where I'm sitting right now, and the guy was across from him. And so my dad, real feebly, stepped up and said, "Don't call me sir, call me Your Majesty." And everybody just laughed. But my dad was a joker like that. If we'd go to a restaurant, he'd always tap the hat off of somebody when we were walking by. Sometimes we were just like, oh my gosh, I don't even think he knows them. But that brought a lot of joy. That brought a lot of joy. So my dad could have all of that. So anyway, when he did start showing those signs, he would start to close up the house. Like I said, he was just always taking care of everything. But it would be like at 5 o'clock. And my mom and I are the same. We'd want everything wide open. And we would say, Dad, not yet. It's still early. And he'd say, oh, okay, okay. And then 10 minutes later, he's doing it again. And my mom would say, Johnny, not yet. And so, okay, okay. And so by the 10th or the 15th, 20th, you run out of your patience and you're saying, Dad, or Johnny. And he'd get mad because, why are we yelling at him? So those are some of the struggles. And now you can laugh about them, but sometimes in the midst of them, they don't seem funny. And sometimes it's scary. My dad couldn't see, so he wouldn't wander off. But he'd always say, I should go for the mail. And he'd repeat over and over those, different things. Like wherever he sat, he could see the neighbor's house. And he'd always ask, is Vecina still alive? Would be his question many, many times throughout the day. And so in that, God is working in us to be more patient, to be more loving. And it's not easy, but it's not easy for the person who has Alzheimer's. They don't know. They don't know that they're doing that. And imagine the fear of not remembering something. I remember that I think I was already 43. And my dad we were talking about something, and I said, Dad, how old do you think I am? And he said, oh, maybe 21, 23. He said that, 23. And I said, Dad, I'm 43. Seeing his face, and he said 43, because my dad was 43 when they had me. And so he to realize you're not the young person that you think you are. He probably thought he was 43. And so those things are difficult. For a lot of things are difficult when you start not to be able to remember. And you're still trying to do, and you're getting older, and you can't take care of and do the things that you want. This is how faithful he was to me, because we struggle sometimes in our relationship, and and God really healed that in me as I grew up, wounds that I needed healing from. But I think God brought me back to help take care of my dad, to really restore and to impart to me just this blessing of fatherhood and my dad to me fully. And we'd go for rides every single day. But I remember when I was in my early 20s and I was babysitting my nephew. And I was here with my dad, and I'm not sure where everybody was and why they weren't here in the house for that weekend, but my dad and I were. And I was heating the nipples to the bottle, back when they had the rubber top, and I fell asleep. And the water evaporated, and the house started to smoke. And my dad got up, and he got me and my little nephew out of the house. And there wasn't a fire, but there was so much smoke. We could have really been, something could have happened. And I remember we were outside, and my dad said to me, "Don't worry, I'll never tell anyone." And my dad never did. My dad never did. And I never told anyone till when my dad passed. But that was my dad's faithfulness. And my dad was so faithful to his friends and so helpful to his friends and to everyone who knew him. And he had good friends who, even when he had Alzheimer's, would come and visit him, take him for coffee. He loved that. They'd go have coffee. That was always what my dad did every day after retirement. And his friends, even when he had Alzheimer's, Mr. Rubio always came for him. Joe Chavez always came to visit and stay with him and talk. Even if they just repeated everything the same day. That's a friend. That taught me what true friendship looks like. And my dad was always a friend. Anyway, so I was living in Denver when my dad really started showing signs, and my mom was it was hard on her. And God started stirring in me to come and help her, and I didn't want to. I was living my life in Denver, and I'd applied to a program there at the university, and the Lord said, "Go home." And in that, I finally said, "Okay." The last year that I was there was so miserable. The Lord allowed it to be so miserable that I left that school, and I said, "I need to be obedient." And it's been the greatest blessing of my life, not just taking care of my dad, but just living back here in a slower pace, being able to go to church every day, working for the church. It's been, what a blessing eternally. I didn't get those things that I thought I wanted in the world, and not that those things are bad, but God had better plans for me, eternal plans. I shared with my mom those times taking care of my dad. And when he would wake up sometimes and he would think I was his sister, and he would think my mom was his mama. And he always remembered my name, but that one time where he did number 4, and then it was always a joke after that I was number 4, and my sister that was born first was number 1. So you start to see them forget people that they really love. And it's hard on those people when you can't recall a name. And everybody that would come to the restaurant, and if we were in a restaurant and they would talk to my dad, and then they would say to me, "Your dad doesn't have Alzheimer's." He remembered me. But as soon as they left, my dad would say, "Who was that?" My dad loved people. So really he was present in that love to that person, even if he didn't remember them. That's a great quality. And he just kept loving and bringing joy. My dad brought a lot of joy to a lot of people. People with Alzheimer's, they lose, we think of all the things that they lose and are saddened. But some of the things that they lose are blessings. And they lose like what people will think, or being reserved. And he just was fully himself and fully bringing joy and joking. And we would be like, "Oh gosh," the people loved it. And the people he was kind to loved it. What else did my dad lose that was a blessing? He lost his anger. He could not remember who he was angry at or what he was angry at. I didn't know what his childhood was like. He didn't speak much about it. I didn't know what war was like, or the hurts of life, or the disappointments, maybe not becoming a doctor, or his dreams not being fulfilled in those areas. he was at peace. He didn't remember who he was not forgiving, who he was angry at. And so he just loved freely. And that was so pure and so beautiful. And that's what God did in it. He blessed my dad with freeing him and preparing him for eternity. My dad was healed. He was healed. Could God have done it a different way? Yes. We live in a broken world, and we have to remember that sickness and death came in. That was never God's plan. And so we have things, like I said, God will allow them if he can do something greater. And I saw beauty, so much beauty and peace and freedom in those last years with my dad. It was difficult for my mom. It was difficult for us. But life isn't easy in our crosses, but it taught me so much. And it made me not be selfish and just to think of myself, but to live and to honor my parents. As the commandment says, honor your mother and father. It's sacrificial. You need to sacrifice, and there's a cost to it. But these people gave us life and took care of us. We are called to do the same. And so I can look back on those times with no regrets and thinking, I loved my daddy and I honored my Heavenly Father with obedience to take care of my dad. And he healed so much of my relationship with my dad. And sometimes I would say this is awful, but I would say, my dad didn't want to really spend that much time with me growing up, and now, Lord, you want me to spend every single day with him. But God was like, Kathy, do what I ask you, and you will see. And I did. I did see. He healed my heart, and he healed my daddy's heart. My dad, those last years, he pondered heaven so much. We would go for those long rides, and I'd play that song, I Can Only Imagine. I can only imagine. And my dad would weep and weep, and he would say, I wonder what it's going to be like when I see Jesus. What's it going to be like when I see my mom and dad? That's what he would say. He was pondering heaven for years, and that was beautiful. That was so beautiful. So 4 days before my dad dies, he sees angels. And I think I've told this story before, but who was that for? Who was that for but for us? And God, and he just blessed us with a vision of angels. It was my dad's vision. And my dad was sitting, and he went like this, and he pointed to the corner and said, the angels are coming. The angels are coming for me, and I want to go with them. And then he looked at my mom and he said, is it okay if I go? She's like, yes, Johnny, go. And so he put his head down and began to weep. And I said, Daddy, are you okay? And he went like this, joy. 4 days later, and it took about 4 days. I would have said he still had years, and his body began to just shut down. And the Lord sent his angels, his guardian angel took him home. And it was beautiful and wonderful, and I don't fear death. I don't fear death. I look forward to it. And when my mom was sick in her last weeks, in her last months, even in her last years, I would say, when she was going through cancer and people, I'd say, what more would I want for my mama than to be with Jesus? And so that is my desire. And that's my desire for everyone. And so my dad, in those years of Alzheimer's, I saw God heal him and prepare him to be with him for eternity, as he is doing with us in our full state of mind, or if we're forgetting things in our sickness. I have many friends that have cancer or autoimmune sickness, diabetes, many different things. We've seen a lot since the vaccine and COVID, and God is stirring in us. Be ready, because I am coming. And it's either in my second coming or when you are called home. And let us meet Jesus like my daddy, who was going to dance for him, who was going to bend his knee to him like that song. He had pondered it. He had pondered the meeting with our Lord. And so let us ponder and let us be ready. Be free of everything that's holding us back from truly living out the life God has called us to, which is a life loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbors. So blessed be God forever, and blessed be God for all He allows and all the greater things He's doing within it. God bless you.